Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We'll begin our event with the Lebanese national anthem, followed by the alma mater.
President Khuri, Provost Dawi, Excellencies, and dear friends from the IUB community, welcome to this event. I'm Lina Abou-Habib of the Asfari Institute for Civil Society and Citizenship. I'm very happy to have you here with us. This is one of the most important conversations we are hosting today, quite timely, and within the mandate of the Institute to discuss prospects, trends, and emerging initiatives that influence governance structures in the Arab region, particularly at this incredibly important moment of transition, of instability. And we're very, very happy to welcome here for the first time at the Asfari Institute, I welcome Professor Haykel. Thank you all for being with us. I want to give the floor to my colleague, Dr. Simon Kachar, for introducing this conversation and its purpose and also its aftermath. Fadlo, Simon.
Thank you, Lina. Mr. President, Excellencies, dear colleagues and friends, good afternoon. It's a true pleasure to see you all here today. On behalf of the IUB Good Governance and Citizenship Observatory and the Asfari Institute, I extend my warmest welcome to each of you. We are gathered here today for what I believe will be a truly insightful and timely discussion. Our topic is one of immense significance, not just for the kingdom, but for the entire region and beyond. In an era marked by rapid transformations and evolving global dynamics, understanding the nuances of governance reform becomes paramount. Saudi Arabia Vision 2030 represents an ambitious and far-reaching blueprint for economic diversification and social change. And its very core lies the fundamental pillars of governance, or what we are highlighting today, Hawkama. The Good Governance and Citizenship Observatory at IUB was established with a clear mandate to foster critical thinking, facilitate robust dialogue and general knowledge around issues of good governance and active citizenship within our Arab context. We believe that genuine progress and sustainable development are linked to transparent, accountable, and inclusive governance structures. We are incredibly fortunate to have with us today a distinguished panelist and discussant, both of whom will bring their profound expertise to this conversation. Professor Bernard Haykel, from Princeton University, a leading scholar of Near Eastern studies, will be sharing his insights as our esteemed panelist. And allow me here, dear Bernie, dear Professor Haykel, to thank you for accepting our invitation and offering a critical and informed perspective as our discussant. We have our very own Dr. Tania Haddad, Associate Professor of Public Administration and Nonprofit Management here at AUB. I am truly grateful for their willingness to share their valuable time and knowledge with us. In a recent analysis published in the Foreign Affairs, Professor Haykel offers an insightful lens through which to view Saudi Arabia's evolving governance strategy. In this article, he underscores how, even amid external geopolitical challenges, Saudi Arabia continues to prioritize its ambitious domestic transformation agenda. In another article titled Saudi Arabia's New Nationalism, published in the Project Syndicate, also Professor Haykel offers valuable context for today's conversations. His insights reveal how the kingdom is on the transformation path, shifting from an oil-dependent rentier state to a diverse civic nationalist economy. At least this is what I understood from the article. This brings us today to the essence of the panel, Hawkama or good governance. Today's panel is an opportunity to delve deeper into how this vision is being realized in practice, how governance reforms are reshaping institutions, and how Saudi Arabia is positioning itself as a forward-looking nation, globally integrated and domestically resilient. Thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to a rich and engaging dialogue. But before we start, I would like to invite the President of AUB, Dr. Fadlo Khuri, to say a few words. President Khuri, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Simon. I believe Tania will introduce Bernie. So they just asked me to say a few words, since Bernie and I have gotten to know each other quite well over the decades since I took this position. And I want to thank Nadia Al-Sheikh, who introduced us some 8 years ago, but we've kept up. So Bernard Haykel is someone I've known, as I indicated, for almost a decade. He's a rare kind of scholar, not only with a real need for how things actually work on the ground, but with the willingness to tell you in a straightforward way what he thinks and to correct you. In the region, for me, he has been the most valuable outside expert by some measure in understanding what's happening in Saudi Arabia. When I've visited him in Princeton or when he's come here, I've always taken advantage of the opportunity to learn more. You know, this is an interesting region, to put it mildly. It's a region where safety is on the surface. People are afraid to go in depth in conversations. That's not Bernie. Bernie's always peeling back the layers. He's not interested in the easy answers. He asks hard questions, not to provoke, not that he's afraid of provoking, but to understand. And when he speaks about Saudi Arabia, governance or reform, it comes from deep knowledge, careful research, honest dialogue with all the stakeholders. Questions like how Vision 2030 is shaping Saudi Arabia in the region are extremely germane to what's happening in Lebanon and the entire region. Saudi Arabia has been for many, many years one of the 2 or 3 most important countries in the region. You could argue Egypt because of its demographic size, Iraq because of its resources and tragedy and difficulty in governing. That would be the short list, I think, if one was quite cold, at least in the non-African part, but I would include in the Arab world probably those 3 countries. So understanding what's happening in Saudi Arabia is critical to understanding not just the implications for Lebanon or Syria and Iraq. That's a massive oversimplification. Saudi Arabia is a global concern. Clearly, President Trump has shown how important Saudi Arabia is in his worldview. And I feel fortunate that today at AUB, we have arguably the most insightful expert, but also one of the most honest experts in the region, not just academically qualified, but more than happy to share careful observations from a place of objectivity, but great knowledge. So Bernie, thank you for being here. We're looking forward to hearing your thoughts and, as always, learning from you. On a personal level, I'm glad I'm going to get to see you a little bit this next day or two. It's not as peaceful as Princeton, but I would argue Beirut is more exciting. It's a rare opportunity that I get to stay and listen for the whole session, so thank you to our VP Administration, my office, for arranging that. A lot to learn. And I'm going to turn it over to Tania for the official introduction. Ahlan wa sahlan.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, very good. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to this panel discussion today on governance in Saudi Arabia. Over the past decade, the kingdom has undertaken one of the most ambitious state-led transformation agendas in the region. Anchored in Vision 2030, these reforms span economic diversification, bureaucratic modernization, social liberalization, and institutional restructuring. The panel today aims to critically examine the governance dimensions of these reforms, including their origins, mechanisms, and implications. Our discussion today will take the form of a moderated, in-depth conversation structured around 4 interrelated thematic areas that are central to understanding the governance reforms trajectory in Saudi Arabia. First, we will examine the motivation and timing of the reform agenda. What political, economic, institutional pressures, both internal and external, drove the state to undertake such a sweeping transformation? Are there reform experiences in other countries that Saudi Arabia considered when initiating its own project? Second, we will explore how these reforms have reshaped the relationship between the state and the citizens, particularly through the strategic deployment of nationalism, identity, and new narratives of civic responsibility. Third, we will turn to the practice and framing of governance itself. Under what terms and conditions are accountability, transparency, and participation being institutionalized? At the end, we will assess the broader regional significance of Saudi Arabia's reform experience. Does it offer a transferable model for other states seeking to modernize? Or is it shaped by a unique context that involves a constellation of resources, institutional capacity, leadership, and political will? We are honored to be joined today by Dr. Bernard Haykel, ahla wa sahla, whose work has critically engaged with questions of state reform, institutional change, and governance in the kingdom. Bernard is a scholar of the Arabian Peninsula, focusing on the politics, economics, and history of the Gulf cooperation countries and Yemen. He is a professor of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University, where he teaches courses on energy, history, and politics. He is author of Revival and Reform in Islam and editor of Saudi Arabia in Transition, both published by Cambridge University Press. His next book, titled The Real Mohammed bin Salman and the Transformation of Saudi Arabia, will be published soon by Penguin Press. Thank you very much for being here. First of all, Bernie, if I may, can you give us a foundational reform, or what is the driver of reform? From an academic perspective, how do you see the primary drivers behind Saudi Arabia's governance reform agenda? Why do you think these reforms were introduced? Were they more shaped by internal imperatives like the economic diversification, consolidation of state legitimacy, finding solution to chronic government inefficiency, or whether they are external, including oil market volatility, international ranking, and the pursuit of foreign investment?
Thank you. If you don't mind, before I answer your question, I would like to say a few words. The first, it's an honor for me to be at AUB. I think this is the first time I've ever spoken at this university, and it is a university that I hold in very high esteem and with great respect. So first, let me say thank you for your kind words, especially those of the President. I also want to thank in particular His Excellency, Ambassador Bukhari, who's an old friend, for appearing here, and of course the other ambassadors, the provost, and the audience. So without further ado, let me try to answer your question. So the driver for reform in Saudi Arabia is a sense that exists among the leadership, but I think it's also prevalent in society that the country, as it was functioning before the accession of King Salman in 2015, that the way in which the country was being run was unsustainable, and that the country needed to dramatically change because there were certain pathologies in the way it was being managed. There was a tremendous amount of corruption, inefficiency, a dependence on oil that was unsustainable. Of course, market volatility was part of it. And that the attempts in Saudi Arabia from the 1960s to diversify their economy with these 5-year plans had never been taken seriously. And that now with the energy transition that was happening, the country really needed to break from its dependence on oil and turning the country from being a redistributive state that basically provided entitlements to the population to becoming a productive state, a state that actually produced wealth outside of the realm of the fossil fuel industry in order to be able to survive beyond the energy transition that was taking place. And what's particularly distinctive about the kingdom, and you don't find it in, say, other countries of the GCC, is the brutal honesty with which the leadership in the kingdom talked about this need. So if you watch a number of the interviews that the Crown Prince and Prime Minister of Saudi Arabia, Prince Mohammed bin Salman, he just tells you, we have a problem, and it's unsustainable, and we need to change. And so he's been the principal driver of the change, but he has needed and required a lot of other Saudis to come along with him, and he's had to convince others to come along with him and to be able to get on with this project. And the project is titled Vision 2030. And you can see that the country is trying to reform socially, although politically it has consolidated power and become much more authoritarian than in the past, while also diversifying its economy and identifying sectors where where the country has comparative advantages. One of them is, of course, tourism of two kinds. One is religious tourism, the other is sort of general tourism, and yet another is mining. They're trying to build a technological sector, a manufacturing sector, and so on. And along with doing all this, there's been a major effort at governance, improving governance structures. And you can feel it, it's palpable in the country. So for instance, and I can mention thousands of examples, but before this transformation, if you needed to get a driver's license or a passport or a building permit or a registration document for land, it was very, very difficult. The Saudis had basically adopted the Egyptian bureaucratic model and then built on it. So anyway, if you know anything about the Egyptian bureaucratic model, you know how impossible it is to deal with it. And Saudi had basically adopted that model. So this was completely demolished as a way of functioning, and e-governance was brought in, so that now, they have an app called Abshir, and all Saudis are on this app, and it's an app that essentially allows them to deal with the government without having to interface with officials. And one of the positive consequences of this is that the petty corruption that existed before just disappeared. And I can say much more about this, but I'm going to stop.
I want to build on what you just said. How do you interpret this reform process? Is it more like a project of state modernization, adaptation, or both? How do you see it? How do you define it?
So I think that the leadership is like all political systems. A political system anywhere in the world seeks to survive, seeks to preserve itself. And so I think that the instinct is one of self-preservation. We have a dynasty in Saudi Arabia. The dynasty has been around since the 18th century. It's actually older than the United States. It began, officially they claim it began in 1727. Before it used to be 1744. But essentially, you have 3 centuries of rule. And so this is a deeply rooted, historically minded dynasty. And you have leaders who basically want to stay in power and look to the future and continue. And the country owes its existence to this dynasty, right? Arabia was never unified until they did that in the 18th century. So I think it's driven by this instinct to preserve the rule of the dynasty. It's also an instinct that, that the relationship to oil and to the rentier economy is unsustainable, and that you needed to also build a new basis for allegiance and for belonging in the country. And so you see a project of nationalism being constructed, rewriting the narrative of the country, and trying to make citizenship the center of identity rather than other forms of identification.
Actually, I want to move to the state-citizenship relationship. So Vision 2030 promotes the idea that national development is a shared mission between the state and the citizens.
Yeah.
And in one of your interviews, you called it nationalistic transformation and Saudi first. In your opinion, how have the reforms changed the relationship between the government and the people, especially in terms of national identity and belonging? Whether economic transformation, giving more the youth job opportunities, how do you see this relationship?
First of all, let me say something about the structure of Saudi society. So Saudi society has about 65% of the population to 70% is under the age of 30, 35. Okay. So the bulk of the population is young. And then you have older people who are used to the older system and the way things used to run before. When you talk to young people in Saudi, and this is anecdotal, I don't have polling data, the young people really love what they see in terms of the changes, in particular women, by the way. And they feel that the country, in its social liberalization, in its empowerment of the young, is giving them a promise for a better future. And of course, there's a risk in this too, because if you overpromise and you don't deliver, you can end up with a population that might feel resentful or cheated. I can get to that a bit later. The older people tend to, like all older people, they don't like change. And so they tend to feel like, what's going on? What's happening here? Do we really want this? Why am I losing the entitlements that I got used to before? And so you do have this division between the older and the younger in the population. I think the young are very much and very deeply invested in this transformation. The older people, I think, less so, because they, as I said, they don't like how things are changing for them.
Bernie, can you develop more or give us an idea more about the idea of citizenship or civic engagement that is appearing nowadays in Saudi Arabia in a way that they feel that they belong to the country, to the reconstruction, to the way things are happening?
Yeah, I mean, the message is clear. You have to be a participant because the government can no longer provide all these things as it did before, and you have to be a participant in that you will be given opportunities. If you're an entrepreneur, if you're a thought leader, if you have an idea, the government will come and help you. Okay, so that's one side of it. The other is the government is setting all kinds of messages to the people, and this is important for Lebanon, which is to say that, you know, why do you have to leave the country to have a good time? Saudi Arabia has a lot of beautiful areas. You can go on tourism inside the country. Don't spend your money abroad, spend it domestically. So there's a strong message that, you know, you have to be not just rooted in this country, but you also have to give back. This was something that was not told to Saudis before. And the message before to Saudis, especially after the first oil boom, which is called Tafra, and then there was a second one in the 2000s, was that basically the government is going to give you everything. You're going to get a scholarship to go overseas. If you can get into a university, you'll get free medical care, free education, you'll get a loan for housing. Everything will be provided for you. And you'll have subsidized energy, you'll have subsidized electricity, and so on. Now, the message is quite different. In fact, they're being taxed. So there's a 15% VAT tax, which is 10% more than what the UAE charges its citizens. So all of this is part of an educational process of trying to inculcate in Saudis that they have to give back and that they are partners with the government. And the government cannot do this all on its own. And that's also a message that's being sent to them as well. Alongside this idea that you should be proud because you're a Saudi. So the nationalist narrative is extremely strong as well.
I want to move to the good governance part, which is the main topic of our discussion today. So how do you see that the current reform is institutionalizing the core principles such as accountability, transparency, citizen participation? In one of your interviews, you said that you had 70% government employees, now we're going down to 60%. So we're moving towards more merit-based employment.
Yes.
Could you give us an idea about what is happening and how all this is being transformed?
Yeah, so 70% of the, before these reforms started, 70% of the population worked for the public sector, right? So essentially the state was a nanny state where you, if you were educated and you had the right degrees, you could get a job in the government. That's no longer possible. So there are no longer long-term employment contracts. You have short-term employment contracts. And increasingly, the private sector is being encouraged to hire more and more Saudis, but in a very serious and systematic way, in order to get people to stop their dependence on the government. And that's a difficult and long-term process. It's not something you can just snap your fingers and get done. So everything that is being done, by the way, is being done, gradually. There are setbacks. Mm-hmm. I'll give you an example of a setback. So in Saudi Arabia, there's an agency called Nazaha, which is basically the anti-corruption agency of the country. Nazaha is created by royal decree and is completely autonomous and only answerable to the king and to the crown prince. So there is no way to interfere with Nazaha if, say, Nazaha goes after an individual for corruption. No one can actually try to interfere to intercede on behalf of the person who has gotten into trouble. So Nazaha has gone about its investigations and really cracked down on corruption, including people who were recently appointed by the government in different parts of the Vision 2030 project. While it's good that this thing is fighting corruption, one of the things it has done, I mean, one of the drawbacks of this is that it has scared government employees and everybody, so that you end up with a situation where people are not willing to take any personal risk. They're not willing to take initiative because they're afraid they might be accused of corruption. So sometimes you go so far in trying to fight corruption that you end up creating institutional paralysis and economic paralysis. So this is one of the problems that the government has faced, which is, we don't want you to be corrupt, but we also don't want you to be paralyzed and not take any initiative. And so all of these are teething problems, we call them, and there are lots of them throughout the whole system, where you take, 2 steps forward, 1 step back, then again. And this is something that is being done in a very systematic way. Often, the problem has to go back to the royal court and to the crown prince. So you have this massive set of problems with a bottleneck issue where for decision making to be taken, it has to go back. And so one of the other problems you have in governance is how do you delegate authority in such a way that not everything has to go back to the crown prince, because there are only so many hours in a day and so many decisions that can be taken. So those are some of the practical problems that are being faced in this effort. And you can see it by looking at how many hours the crown prince was working. So so he started in earnest this whole project in 2016, 2017. And for the first few years, maybe 4 or 5 years, he was working, nonstop, like 20 hours a day, getting very little sleep. And you can see in the last couple of years that he's been able to sort of relax a bit more, spend more time doing other things, to be able to have different agencies, different ministries take on the job of actually running the country, and where he doesn't have to intervene in every single issue as he was before.
And when we were discussing the panel, you mentioned the role of the consultancies, external consultancies in rebuilding.
Yes.
Could you give us more details about what is happening, their role, and the effect?
Yeah, I can. So these are management consultancies, mainly, companies like BCG and McKinsey and others who were called on early on by the government to give the government models, because the government was always interested in benchmarking. So in other words, what is the speed of the internet in Saudi Arabia versus the speed of the internet in other countries? So to benchmark. Are we okay? Are we very bad? Or how can we get better? If there's a very fast internet speed, say in Singapore, how did Singapore do it? What can we do to become like Singapore? So these were the kinds of questions that were being asked of management consulting companies, and the management consultants were coming up with answers for this. And one of the reasons they needed these companies is because the bureaucracy itself in Saudi Arabia either didn't want any change, because bureaucrats generally don't like change, and also they have limited capacity in terms of being able to see beyond their own borders. So they don't know what's happening in the UAE, they don't know what's happening elsewhere. So you needed these management consulting companies for establishing benchmarks in different areas, and literally every area. So how long does it take for a product that enters Saudi Arabia to clear customs? Why does it take so many days, whereas it takes fewer time? So this was all with the view of turning the kingdom into a major hub for transport, logistics, shipping, telecommunications, tech, and so on. So you needed to understand how other countries do things and how to improve your own performance. And this gets to the other point, which is what they were very interested in, are these things called key performance indicators, KPIs. So everything, the entire Saudi bureaucracy became obsessed with KPIs. How do you improve your performance? And hitting actual, specific targets in every ministry and every sub-ministry and every project and so on. So this is where the management consultants came in. Now, the problem with management consultants, as I'm sure you know, is that very often they try to gauge what you want, and then they just produce a product that essentially confirms what it is you want, not necessarily telling you that there are limitations, this is not appropriate for this country, for here it's appropriate for another country, and so on. Like when you're benchmarking Saudi Arabia to Norway, those are two very different economies, two different societies. So often those differences were not being fully admitted to by the consultancies, and I think they took advantage of the kingdom, and the kingdom spent a lot of money and on these consultancies, and often just to be able to get a viewpoint that confirmed the existing bias in the system. And so now they've kind of stopped being so dependent on them. So you see kind of a withdrawal from the management consultancy business in the kingdom. So that's the kind of role that they've played. They were important at a particular point in time. They're much less important now.
And how do you see like the good governance strategies nowadays? Transparency, accountability.
So it's a work in progress. I mean, I think by some measures, the kingdom is far ahead of even their own expectations. On e-governance being one of them, for example. But there are two things I think about the kingdom's approach that you need to kind of keep in mind. One is that the goals were always aspirational. I don't think the crown prince and the people around him ever expected to hit 100% target. They were happy if they got to 40%, 50% of the targets that they established in the vision, right? So they never these were very aspirational figures with the knowledge that you can't really attain them, but you're trying to attain them. The second thing that they did is what I would call a scattershot approach. So let's say you want to build 10 different sectors in the economy for your diversification drive, right? Some of them will work, some of them will not work, but you need to try everything. It's like throwing things at the wall and seeing what will stick, so that they also adopted this approach. So some things have worked, some things have worked much less, some things haven't worked at all. And the question is, do you admit to that, right? Because you've already have sunk costs in different projects, do you admit to failure? And I think they are doing that. You can see it now, for instance, and you'll hear about this in the news. NEOM has been scaled back. NEOM is this big section of northwestern Saudi Arabia, originally the size of Massachusetts or of Belgium, originally estimated to cost $500 billion. In fact, it's going to cost several $1 trillion if they build it out according to the original plan. They don't have that money because of the price of oil and because of the other demands on the budget. So they've scaled back significantly the NEOM. And I think this is a very healthy sign. This is a sign of like basically facing reality and saying, you know, there are things we can achieve and things we cannot achieve. And there are things that don't need to be finished by 2030. We can move them out to 2035 or 2040. And so you see the system kind of self-correcting, admitting to limitations, and I think that's a very good thing.
I want to move to the regional significance and whether there is certain transferability of the lessons learned. So what do you see as the regional implications of Saudi reforms experience? So is it a replicable model of managed transformation that might inform reform trajectory in the region? Or is it a case shaped by exceptional factors such as resource wealth, state capacity, and centralized leadership?
So look, I mean, I should have actually, I made there's a kind of lacuna in what I mentioned at the beginning. I didn't mention Simon, and I should have thanked Simon. And the reason your question prompted me to remember Simon is because he's worked on Fuad al-Shahab. So I think, you know, if you look at the history of Lebanon, where you have very strong leadership that is not corrupt and that has a vision and that's willing to work hard and to control the different agencies of the government, as we had with Fuad al-Shahab in this country, and you have someone with Mohammed bin Salman now in Saudi Arabia, so you know, there are comparisons that you can make. You know, when you get a kind of leader who's willing to, by force of will, impose reform, that's transferable. Now, there are other things that are not transferable, right? So, for instance, Saudi Arabia, of course, it's the second largest reserves in the world. In terms of conventional reserves, it's the first largest reserves in the world. It has incredible spare capacity, so it's the central bank of oil in the world. It is very large. It's the size of Western Europe. It has a large population, a very talented population because of all the hundreds of thousands of students who studied abroad and now have come back. Those things are very difficult to replicate. You know, but now we, for instance, here in Lebanon, we have things that the Saudis don't have. There's a Lebanese diaspora that is incredibly wealthy and incredibly talented, right? And that is willing, and that loves Lebanon and is willing to you know, bring back and give to Lebanon. The Saudis don't have a diaspora, right? I mean, their talent is all in the country. So, you know, countries have different comparative advantages. Certainly some things can be transferred and others not. But one of them, I think, that can be transferred is this urgent need for powerful, centralized, clean, non-corrupt leadership that Saudi has and that, unfortunately, Lebanon doesn't have.
I have so many other questions, but I'll stop here and open the floor for Q&A.
Don't be shy.
President Khuri.
So, Bernie, without patronizing, saying it was very illuminating. Of course, it was very illuminating. It's also thought-provoking, recognizing that they will get to 2030 by making the kingdom, maybe 20, 30, 40% tops of the agenda will be done. And in my view, the Saudi population is unique, but also, like all peoples, not completely unique. And it's all about confidence in the program, whether you're talking about an institution, a company, a country. So far, the momentum, the confidence seems to be there. What are the things that could derail that? I mean, other than force majeure, a major war in the region that pulls.
Yeah.
And I'm not talking Yemen scale war, I'm talking larger war that pulls. What are the things that keep, or should keep, MBS, the crown prince, the prime minister, up at night to derail his grand project? What are the things that he worries about, or what are the things he should worry about?
Yeah. So, I mean, the most obvious thing, and this is a rule of thumb in petrostates, is the price of oil, right? So if you have a low price of oil, relatively speaking, for a long period of time, that will drain, that will restrict the resources that you need to be able to deploy, these resources in order to diversify the economy. So I think this is an issue that is, and there's something called the break-even price of oil, which is what you need to be able to cover your expenses. So that's one.
Yeah, I think I misstated my statement,
Right.
so let me clarify. In leadership, in everything, you have the known known, the known unknown, and the unknown unknown, right? The known known is price of oil, economic decline, global markets sink. And the unknown unknown is something that you probably can't really calculate, but maybe you can react to. But what's the known unknown that keeps them up at night?
So, I think getting the private sector to become fully, to go into full partnership with the government. At the moment, what you have is the government is moving into sectors of the economy, building new sectors of the economy where the private sector is not willing to go. And the reason the private sector is not willing to go is because the private sector is very risk averse, right? You're going into whole new areas where the kingdom has never built out these industries. And so the first mover has to be the government. But the government can't sustain these sectors in the long term. You need to eventually get the private sector to come in and become your partner. And I think that's an issue, because you need to get the private sector to be willing to take at least a minimum amount of risk once you've moved in to be able to partner with you. Without that, you cannot create the jobs that are necessary for for diversifying the economy. I think the other thing that worries, that would worry me, I'm not sure it worries him. He's a force of nature. The guy is a super optimist. If you give him 4 scenarios, very bad, middle bad, middle good, and super positive, he's always going to go for the super positive. That's his temperament. But something that would worry me is that if you don't deliver on the jobs in the private sector for this youth bulge that you have in your population, what happens if they feel disappointed, feel that they've been cheated of the promise of these jobs? And then you have forces in society that are willing to capture this disenchantment and this resentment, namely the forces of Islamism. I mean, so you still have a strong Islamist element in society. They're keeping their heads down because he's kind of crushed them, but they're there, and they have a discourse, they have a whole ideology of resentment and self-victimization, and they're very anti-government, and they're not gone. They're still around. So I would be very concerned about that. So he has to deliver. I mean, he really must deliver the jobs in order to keep this population from turning to other ideologies that would be very destructive for the country.
I mean, for me, the other thing that I worry about is having had a relationship with the kingdom at the private sector and other areas, both medical and otherwise, is one could argue this is their greatest generation. I mean, having watched people come back from abroad, they have, and Drate, another person with gray hair, did some coaching recently. No, it's okay. Of their top-tier health sector people. They have a lot of human capital that's back, but they're back with very high expectations. Yes. And these are a group that he needs to keep on his side because they're his natural allies.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, but Saudis in certain industries that are where you have merit-based and prestige employment, there are certain sectors where Saudis have done extremely well. So obviously in the oil and gas industry, you have top people. Saudi Aramco is one of the best run oil companies in the world, and SABIC as well. In the finance industry, you have top Saudis. I mean, they're world class. In the medical field, also doctors, at that level, maybe not nursing and so on. But exactly, the point you made, which is to get people to feel pride and to feel satisfied with less than the super prestigious positions is going to be one of the big challenges and is the big challenge for the population. And then building up the human capital in that mid-range is going to be problematic, difficult.
Thank you, Bernie. One of the most exciting and actually I would say unexpected developments early on was, I would call it women's empowerment in the kingdom. And that's actually maybe one of the things which are, just to follow up on Tania's, maybe transferable to the region. Maybe it's more slowly, but it's definitely an overture that was impactful, I think, to the kingdom as well. And so can you tell us a little bit more about the impact of that on governance, on other social reforms, economic reforms, and so on?
Yeah. So I'll say a word about this. So, you know, to understand what's happening in Saudi Arabia, sometimes you have to look at other examples of places. So one place that I've looked at quite a bit is Singapore. And Singapore had a leader who was very important. His name was Lee Kuan Yew. He's passed away. And in one interview with Lee Kuan Yew, he basically said something that, you know, would come straight out of the mouth of Mohammed bin Salman. Same sentiment. Lee Kuan Yew said once, you know, I'm hiring women, and I want women because they're better. They're just a better human capital. They're harder working, they're more efficient, they're more disciplined, better educated, etc. And it's exactly the same in Saudi Arabia. So I think it's not sort of rooted in sort of feminism. It's not ideological. It's very practical. Everything that's done there is based out of pragmatism and practicality. So I think they just looked at he looked at his human capital. He saw that women were harder working, more disciplined, better educated, and so on. And he wanted to give them that opportunity. Also, the other thing that guides this policy is this notion, again, when you speak to the prince, I'll just call him MBS for our sake. When you speak to him, one of the things that he wants, again, for practical reasons, is for the country to be quote unquote normal. In other words, you cannot have a diversified, dynamic economy and society if it's a weird place. If women can't be seen in public, if people are harassing, religious police is harassing young people, whether male or female, it just doesn't work. So you have to do these things because you have to compete in the world and not be left behind. And so I think the empowerment of women is very much in that spirit. It's also trying to force the men to become, to basically give them a kick, in the pants and get them to be, also more disciplined, harder working, and so on. And it's driven by a third thing, which is that life is expensive in the kingdom. I don't know if you've been to Riyadh lately, but it's an expensive city. And you can no longer survive if you're a young couple on a single salary. So you need two salaries. And so, again, this is something that makes sense for economic reasons. And by the way, it's having an effect on fertility rates, and there's a collapse in fertility in the country because of this, because better educated women, women in the workforce, and so on. So the whole country is changing because of this. But I think it's largely driven by this need to become a dynamic country, and you cannot do that without women.
Sadi?
Yes, sorry. Thomas Schellen, Executive Magazine. We just had the chance to interview the Minister of State for Administrative Reform in Lebanon last week. And in that conversation, it was very clear that good governance is a high priority in Lebanon. And actually, Mr. Maki made reference to the Saudi system when he talked about other systems in the region. Can you say a little bit more about the institutional framework in Saudi Arabia for ensuring good governance? I understand that there are several ministries and institutions involved. And secondly, the role of the Crown Prince. How important is it in ensuring the sustainability of this initiative? Thank you.
Sari.
Hello, Sari Hanafi, professor of sociology here. Three quick questions. Abdurrahman al-Kawakibi highlights since the end of 19th century that the Arab world is not only under political tyranny, but also religious tyranny. So I do understand that in Saudi Arabia, it has been a competing between two authorities, religious and political authorities. And then we have in the history example of Turkey, where you have, if you like, authoritarian religious reform. Then I think now Saudi Arabia took the same path. But I mean, it's a risky path. I would like you to comment about religious reform versus political reform, or lack of political reform. Second point, I feel that Saudi Arabia took a very neoliberal political economy. I mean, just two examples. I see, for instance, when I was in Riyadh, you need to pay $30 to enter to the public space in the downtown of Riyadh. So it's not accessible to anyone. So those only who pay 100 riyal. Also, I mean, line to whom? And I think line now is in a big crisis. Can you say about the Neom? Yeah. And final point is, I mean, observing the Saudi declaration about the current genocide on Gaza, I think they are really high profile. But then, I mean, I think they reiterate that there is no normalization without the Arab Peace Initiative, etc. But then I don't understand why they give the American, I mean, $3 trillion. I mean, not only them, but Qatari and Emirati, without while this current genocide is still there. Without they didn't condition, for instance, this investment against a ceasefire and a political solution for Palestine. Thank you.
Can we take one more question, Minister Mike?
Hi. So I'm happy to be quoted by my colleague. So I'm the new Minister for Admin Reform in Lebanon, and glad to hear what you had to say. One thing that we're trying to follow is the lessons learned from their governance model on certain admin reform things, for instance, digital transformation. I think we definitely need the coordination models. They have the Supreme Council, they have authorities, so we're trying to kind of develop some of that in line. And when we're trying to do the blueprint of the new government that we're working for, the 2035 for Lebanon, we definitely no longer have to look at Singapore, Finland, Europe. We have the best in class near us, Saudi Arabia, and what they've done over the last 10 years, and a few other GCC countries. So we're glad to see those very close. But one thing we're still suffering from, despite our best effort, is how entrenched is sectarian politics, even in the senior recruit, which I'm overseeing, despite the fact that I'm trying to make it more difficult to kind of choose, even in the short list. So we get to produce a short list, for instance, in the senior recruit for certain positions. And I borrowed some behavioral science principles slightly to make it more difficult for the Council of Ministers to choose number 3, number 4, by telling them this is 1, 2, 3, 4. It's a short list. You can choose whoever from that short list, but by making that implicit order, I'm telling them number 1 is the number 1, but you could equally choose from the rest, but I mean, the number 1 is what you should go for. And honestly, it's not working because they're opting without any guilt for whoever fits their kind of delimitation of power. However, what we're trying to do is not eliminate at this stage. It's baby steps. It's reduced that margin. And that's unfortunately all we could do. So we're unable to do drastic measures like what the Crown Prince did in starting 9 years ago. We're only opting for kind of the baby steps, the gradual steps, but we're working against perception of corruption, which is slightly unfair. And that's going to change probably little by little, but it's not yet reflected in the eyes of the population. So I just wanted to make that point.
Thank you. Let me just give you an example, an anecdote that shows you how in Saudi Arabia they've been able to deal with some of these issues. So they don't have sectarian issues there in the same way that we do here in Lebanon, but they do have. They had a royal family that was extremely predatory and parasitic on the society, that had all kinds of privileges. Now they have what they did was, and I'll give you this anecdote. So I was at the airport. I was at Riyadh, and I was standing in line, for passport control, and a guy showed up with a tall, elegant-looking man and cut the line. And this young assistant said to the police officer, the passport control officer, "This is Prince such and such. We're going through." So the police officer, the passport control guy, loudly said, "I don't care who he is. He can go and stand at the back of the line, and if he has any issues, he can take it up with His Royal Highness Mohammed bin Salman." Everyone heard it. The Saudis who were standing in line, I could see, they were so happy that a prince who used to have these privileges was basically told, take your place. So it's this, and what's interesting in the anecdote is not the humiliation of the prince, but it's the courage that the policeman had to be able to do what he did and not fear repercussions. And that he would only have done because he knows that the government is fully behind him. And it's that kind of thing, those small things that make all the difference. But they do have these coordination, they have, to go back to governance, they have an institute for improving governance that is not just directed at the government, but also at the private sector and the NGO sector. They have, and they admit to having problems in terms of different ministries overlapping and problems with coordination and so on. So they're trying to address problems, and it doesn't always work, by the way. It doesn't. Sometimes it requires the personal intervention of the crown prince to bang heads together to get things. And what you need is that individual who can bang heads. And I don't know whether you have that in Lebanon. That's one of the issues. Okay, so let me turn to was it Professor Hanafi? I think yes. Okay, so I think the way the political leadership in Saudi Arabia, and not just in Saudi Arabia, you have it also in the UAE. When they think of religion, they have no problems with people being religious, and religion being a fundamental aspect of the identity of the country and of the sense of what it is to be Saudi. Islam is an integral part to that identity. The problem they have is with an ideological Islam as a political ideology. That they will not tolerate. Because Islam as a political ideology essentially means that you have people who can invoke God and arrogate to themselves authority and then deploy the religion as an ideology to fight the government and so on. That they will not tolerate, and they're extremely repressive when it comes to that. So they're trying to say that and also if you look at the history of Saudi leadership, this idea that there was always a partnership between the religious establishment and the Saudi royal family, there's a bit of a myth there. The Saudi royal family was always in complete control of the religious leadership and deployed religion for its own purposes, for its own political purposes. The religious establishment was never independent. If it ever tried to be fully independent, it was crushed. And so what's happening now is that the instrumentalization of religion for politics that was the past tradition is no longer of interest to the leadership and has basically been told to step aside. and it's being told to step aside because the reforms that are required or that are deemed to be required cannot tolerate the interference of the religious establishment, especially if it's politicized. So you have legal reforms, you have a complete revamping of the legal codes, of course the social reforms and so on, and the religious establishment is being told, you know, people are free. If they want to be religious, they can be religious. If they want to be religious, that's their business, and you cannot interfere in their lives. And this is a major break with the history of the country and the way in which the government gave latitude and power and authority to the religious establishment to interfere in the public space of the society. So I think that's kind of how it's being understood. That this is a neoliberal economic project, absolutely. There's no question that that's what you know, the leadership is capitalist. It wants to be part of an American-led neoliberal economic order. It doesn't see, but I think what you were referring to is the amount that's made, that people are made to pay to visit this area called Bujairi in Dir'iyah. So this is not really kind of a public space yet. This is not downtown Riyadh. You can go down to downtown Riyadh, you don't have to pay anything. This is kind of a tourist site, a kind of almost like a model UNESCO-style tourist site that's aimed at an elite audience, both domestic and international, and that's why they charge. Now, you can say that's wrong, you should allow it to be open to everyone, but it is very much, a lot of the projects that they have are aimed at an elite audience, and is that going to produce resentment by, say, the poorer segments of society? It might. And in any neoliberal project, you end up with people who don't succeed and who don't do well, and what do you do with them? One answer to that in the Saudi government case is they've established kind of a list of essentially poor people. Who are the poor in the country? I think about 11 million people have signed up for this, and they get specific handouts to compensate for their, for their economic impecuniousness, let's say. The question of Palestine and normalization. So I think there's something deeply entrenched in the Saudi political culture after 1973, which is when Saudi Arabia used oil as a weapon, as a political weapon, and then ended up suffering the consequences of having done that. So despite the fact that they had an oil boom and a quadrupling in the price of oil and all this wealth that came in, that deployment of oil as a political tool led to a dramatic change in the West and its relationship to energy. So you had the development of the conservation movement in the West. You had you had the discoveries of entirely new areas of oil fields in the North Sea and in other places, in Alaska, for instance. And that led to a 2+ decades long decline in oil prices. So the oil prices basically were extremely low from around 1985, 86 till 2003. You have to remember, in the late 1990s, the price of the barrel was $9 for most of that time. So the Saudis internalized a lesson that you don't politicize kind of money and economics, because it can rebound and damage your own economy. And I think the promises of these trillions of dollars, these are just promises, you know. I think they're appealing to President Trump's vanity and ego. They know how to play him, and I think very little of that money will actually be ever deployed in the United States, not least because they need the money to be deployed domestically and not overseas. So I think you have to cut through a lot of the hyperbolic, you know, promises. But on the question of Palestine, the Saudis have held the line, essentially that unless there is a complete ceasefire immediately and a pathway to Palestinian statehood, they will never normalize with Israel. And in any case, the normalization with Israel was never really about Israel. It was really about what Saudi Arabia could get out of the United States. And what Saudi Arabia in its Saudi first policy wants from the United States are 5 things. And I'll just quickly list them here. Forgive me, I'm talking maybe a bit too much and in too long-winded a way, but they want a mutual defense agreement. They want a nuclear agreement for civilian nuclear power generation with enrichment in the country. They want a free trade agreement. They want an artificial intelligence agreement. And they want a streamlined and a process for purchasing weapons without these weapons being blocked in Congress as they always do. They want to be treated like a NATO country when it comes to weapon procurement, because the Saudis pay for their weapons and these weapons get blocked in Congress almost invariably. So those are the 5 things they want from the United States. And for that, if the Palestinian issue is addressed, they might be willing to normalize. So again, it's driven by a nationalistic kind of policy rather than something that's ideological at a grander scale.
We'll take 2 more questions and then we'll invite Lina for the
Hello.
closing remarks.
Norma Makarim from AUB Online Education. Obviously, I'm interested to know, where do you see opportunity for us as regional experts and educators in terms of the governments and to contribute to this capacity building? We all know that HRDF are really investing internally in all their certifications and programs through HADAF program and all these programs. As AUB, how do you see we can take advantage of that?
We'll take 2 questions. Yes, please.
All right, thank you. Hi, Nasreen from the Faculty of Medicine. I'm just listening to you, and thank you. This is very enlightening about the situation. I mean, I'm not into politics a lot, but this is interesting. And I'm sitting here thinking about the good governance that you're talking about and how this example, and thinking really, is it maybe too utopic to think of a Middle East of our own that we make? And using this example or the examples you give, and I think that Saudi Arabia is the only country in this Middle East that is in a position to lead us all, the nations, into that example and eventually creating our own world with our own terms and maybe not relying anymore on so much external. And I'm just really hoping, I belong maybe to a generation that's becoming extinct, but really hoping to see unity amongst our people to do good with what we have and build a good future to our children. Again, using our own good governance and our own capacities and talent, which we have different talents in this big whole region. Thank you.
Yes, please.
Yeah, Salim Shaheen, Central Bank of Lebanon, Vice Governor. So Salim Shaheen, Vice Governor at the Central Bank of Lebanon. Thank you very much, Bernie, for the discussion and the presentation. During the last years, the Saudi Kingdom has done a great work in terms of economic diversification, managing the expectations of youth. And an example about it is the significant drop in the unemployment rate at the youth level. We used to have it at the 25% in the 90s and 2000, and now we're at 14% during the last 4 years, which is a great thing for us. Maybe lessons to learn from that experience. Despite the Saudization, they've worked on creating an entrepreneurial culture, the skills building, the Jadarat program. Can you help us understand a bit more what they've done, and maybe we can benefit from that to help our youth also?
Hello, my name is Nail Qaisi. Don't do anything special, to be honest, but I really like to attend this conference. My question to you is considering that this reform aims to connect the citizens and the government together, how can we ensure that corruption doesn't sneak in a way, considering that there is some kind of resistance from the people since it's something new and that they're introduced to? That's it.
And one last question, sorry, Rabia. Okay.
So, I direct the Center of Community Engagement. I'm interested about what you mentioned that the youth are behind the reforms. Can you tell us what channels are provided for the youth when it comes to decision making?
Next question.
Yeah, I mean, we heard about probably the challenges or the decelerators of change. I would like to hear from you about the accelerators of change. What needs to be done in order to continue the momentum and probably reach something that we haven't reached yet, structurally, operationally, strategic-wise? or systemically in order to sustain this change?
You mean specifically in the kingdom?
In the kingdom.
Okay. All right. So let me, I think that, okay, I'm going to be extremely blunt when it comes to how I think Saudi Arabia sees Lebanon. So there's an older generation of Saudis that loves Lebanon because, you know, they used to come here and they, you know, had a wonderful time here. There's a deep, deep kind of connection to Lebanon among the older generation of Saudis. I think the younger generation doesn't feel that way at all. Because, you know, of the war, they haven't come here as often or know it, although they are plugged into the culture of Lebanon because Lebanon plays a very important role culturally in the Arab world. I think Lebanon can play an important role in the Saudi, in what's happening in Saudi Arabia and can reignite interest from Saudis in Lebanon. But the present leadership in Saudi Arabia wants to see the Lebanese invested in their country. So the old pattern of the Lebanese going to the Saudis, which unfortunately became endemic, basically asking for money and saying, you know, come and help us, that's not going to work anymore. The Saudis are just not interested in giving money to help the Lebanese pro bono. They want to see the Lebanese invested in their country in the way that they are invested in Saudi Arabia. In other words, any Lebanese politician who goes to Saudi Arabia says, you know, you have to help me because, you know, I'm X person and I need my son to inherit my leadership, is going to get no attention whatsoever. But if you're a Lebanese politician and you tell the Saudi leader, I have a vision for Lebanon, I have a project for Lebanon, and I want you to partner with me, then I think you will get a more receptive answer from, and a more positive answer from the Saudis. They want to see skin in the game, as we say in America. And if you don't have skin in the game, they're not going to be interested in helping. And I think Lebanon has a lot of culture and it has a lot of experience in education in particular that can be super helpful to Saudi Arabia. So they're open to the Lebanese, but not in this sort of parasitic way in which the Lebanese have dealt with the Saudis for decades now. That pattern has to be broken. On the question of the question you asked, the medical person you asked me. So, look, as I see it in the Middle East, and you have sort of two ways of thinking about the future. You have a group of people who are looking at the past and feeling resentment and feeling that they're victims and that they're owed something. And I think that some people in the Middle East absolutely should are right to feel this way, namely the Palestinians, okay? But I don't think the Lebanese should feel that way. I don't think I don't think other Arabs, the Egyptians, for instance, should feel that way. And then you have this other group of Arabs who are not looking at the past, but they're looking at the future. And they're seeing Vietnam, and they're seeing China, and they're seeing India, and they're seeing all this forward momentum in these countries, and they realize that if they don't change, they're going to be left behind, especially as oil and gas becomes less and less valuable. And I think that's where Saudi Arabia fits. It's not driven by ideology, it's driven by this clear-eyed vision that we are going to end up with nothing if we don't change. And so you have to decide sort of which camp you want to be in. Do you want to be in the camp that basically is constantly saying, we're victims and we're owed something and we're going to blow things up and destroy things and fight America, etc.? Or are you going to be opportunistic and frankly just very self-serving to get ahead? And I think that's the choice that we're often faced, including in Lebanon. I mean, there are people who have these two different ways of thinking about the world. And one has to decide between one or the other. And Saudi Arabia is very much like in the future. We want not to be left behind. And so they don't like the politics of resentment, which they feel exists amongst Islamists, amongst leftists. It does, you know, it does, ما بيطعم خبز, as we say in Arabic, right? It doesn't feed you.
The law of the world anyway is for change. And the laws of the life, you have to change.
Yeah.
You have to adapt.
Yeah, but some people don't. I mean, some people are not like that. I mean, some people are really, huh? Yeah, but at what cost, right? Like what, you know, look at Syria, look at Yemen, look at Libya. I mean, these are tragic situations. And they're in part a result, I mean, you can blame the West all you want, but in the end, there's also.
I'm not blaming anybody. It's
Yeah.
just that, you know, there is no other alternative than moving forward.
Yeah.
There's nothing, no more button than this button.
That's, yeah, I agree. I agree. And now you're sounding more and more like MBS as you say this. And in terms of unemployment, I mean, basically, you know, they're trying different ways to get their youth unemployed. I think they started first with women. It seemed to have worked really well. And then, you know, tried to get as many opportunities for young people through different programs, and through improving education, and also this idea that, you know what, if a Saudi has to be work at a cash register, or if a Saudi has to work as an Uber driver, that's fine. You know, we're not going to we're going to sort of encourage that. And I think that's what has happened. Although the leadership wants them to get better jobs. I mean, they don't want them stuck as Uber drivers. They want them to end up in better employment. And they're constantly trying different schemes and different experiments to improve the employment conditions of the youth. In terms of corruption and resistance, I mean, basically, you get punished for being corrupt. I mean, seriously punished. And that's why, you know, that you know, I don't see an attempt to, you know, to go back to the old days. And I think those old days are gone. And even if MBS were not around, you had a new prince, you know, in charge, there's no turning back from what's happened. Yeah, I think, and then the last question, which was on decision making and the role of youth. I mean, there are all kinds of ways people express themselves, but this is a top-down project. This is not a bottom-up project. It is very much a top-down project. So in that sense, it's like Lee Kuan Yew, it's like Ataturk, and I hope it succeeds.
Thank you very much, Bernie. Lina, with the closing remarks, thank you.
Very short. Thank you so much, Professor Haykel. There are 2 points, actually, that you prompted, and this is what I want to close with. You know, AUB participates almost every year in the UN Commission for the Status of Women. It's held at the UN headquarters. We were together, Dr. Haddad and I, in March. And this year's Commission on the Status of Women was presided by Saudi Arabia. And it was a very difficult year for the negotiations with the Trump administration. All the delegations were sanitizing their words and everything. And when we were meeting with officials, people were saying, actually, you know what, Saudi Arabia was the only one talking about gender justice, which was, you know, something that we actually used very much, and it was very well done. And it was, I think, very bold in March 2025 in New York. So, and this circles back to what Nadia was saying. In terms of policies and politics that push women forward. There's still a lot to be done, but I think this is a great example. And you said something, Bernie, if I may, on anti-corruption vision, working hard, work ethics, and institutionalization. And yesterday we were, and I'm glad Dr. Makki is with us. Yesterday, as AUB, we had a conversation between civil society and a number of parliamentarians. And And none of this was there in the conversation. It was very disheartening to see that the conversation was around the demands, the asks for gender equality in the country with the upcoming parliamentary election in 2026. It was very disheartening because the male politicians, not only did they not have a vision about it, they couldn't care less. And actually, it made me think when you were talking that, and this has been a conversation, a divisive conversation in civil society. How do you get there? Is it a bottoms-up or a top-down approach? I don't think we have the answer, but it was obvious for us that with many of the elected officials in Lebanon right now, it's not on the agenda. And how do we put it on the agenda? Because the country doesn't work without it and without a clear. And maybe how do we move for Lebanon in terms of being punished for being corrupt versus what we have now, which is being punished for not being corrupt, I think. So thank you very much. Thank you all for being here. And thank you, Tania. Thank you, Professor Haykel, and all our colleagues. Thank you. Please join us. Please join us for a networking reception outside. Thank you for being with us, and thank you, Dr. Khuri.